wants to do a question to line up, please, with the mic so we can get it on videotape.
Start?
I think it should be active.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very impressive speech. I want to pick up one point. Tell you about Jefferson said that he thought the giving tax exemption to churches violated the separation of.
No, Madison.
Was it Madison?
Yes.
I've often wondered if it was the non-taxation of churches. I always assumed it was because of the separation of church and state, that and I often wondered what you thought. Well, what do you think about that?
Well, what I think actually is that exempting churches from taxes is all right if all other nonprofits, including secular ones, have the same exemption. You see, the reason I bring up Madison is to show how definitive he was on separation. But I think the best answer is for the non-believer to have equal rights with the believer. So, for instance, if a nation gives a tax exemption to the property of a church, but gives a tax exemption to an atheist organization that's equal, I don't think there's a problem. But when the benefits of nonprofit status are greater for the religious than the non-religious, there is a problem. I'll give you an example. There is a movement underway in the United States. Right now, under American law, if you are a nonprofit entity, you cannot specifically endorse or oppose a candidate for public office, which is the constraint I'm laboring under representing Center for Inquiry. But many religious right-wing operatives claim that churches should be exempt from this because they have a free exercise of religion right to endorse candidates, which would mean only churches of all nonprofits could endorse candidates, and we still couldn't. So anytime the religious receive a benefit not applicable to the non-religious, then you have a church-state violation.
I hope I wasn't just losing my concentration, but this question might sound a bit simplistic. We all probably know here that there have been many controversies about judge-made law, which are interpretations by judges rather than bills that are passed by politicians. In this case, I'm not quite understanding how the First Amendment could be changed by judges. For instance, in Canada, we have a charter that came, I think it was 1981, it was our Bill of Rights, Charter of Rights and Freedom. And after that charter came into being, people already said, oh boy, we're going to have a lot of court cases now questioning certain laws because the charter takes precedence over those laws, and some of those laws will contravene the charter. So there have been many, many, many interpretations by judges that have thrown out laws because they don't adhere to the charter. How could a judge, or judges, voting 5-4 now the opposite way, get rid of the First Amendment? I can understand that they can interpret it in a certain way, but I think that would be kind of difficult. So how can this be done other than by actual politicians changing it?
They wouldn't get rid of it, they would reinterpret it. What I said in my presentation was there are two competing interpretations. One that says government must be neutral on matters of religion, and I gave you the reasons why I believe that's correct from the history of the founding of the First Amendment. And then the other view that government can still favor believers collectively over non-believers. The history that I just provided to you is disputed by the religious right. And so the First Amendment will not be scuttled, but it would be reinterpreted by a religious right-wing United States Supreme Court, to exclude the non-believer from protection and to allow government to favor religion collectively over non-belief and just prohibit favoring one religion over another. But the argument I gave you for the currently prevailing law that requires neutrality between believer and non-believer and the equality of the non-believer would be reinterpreted out of the new interpretation of the First Amendment. That's what would happen.
Yes, that's what I thought you did
Yes,
say.
yeah, that's exactly what, yeah, that's.
Just a quick thing, could that not be challenged? I know what you would, it could be challenged by many, bringing up the history that you gave us of interpretations. Could it not be challenged, except that, I know what your answer would be, because of the 5-4, no matter who challenged it, would that be what
Yes,
would
you see,
happen?
here's what's happening. Curiously, since 1947, when in Everson versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court first announced the interpretation of government neutrality, for 61 years, our side has been accused of judicial activism. Our side has been accused of ignoring the plain language of the First Amendment and its history. Our side has been accused of violating the intent of the founders by removing God from government. So the accusation that you rightfully would lob at religious right-wing judges who would alter the current interpretation is what we have been chafing under. And Senator McCain in the past 6 weeks has been talking about no longer allowing on our courts activist judges who make up law as they go along. That's a code word for reinstalling the view of the religious right. Mm-hmm. And so if you read, for instance, Chief Justice Rehnquist's dissent in Wallace versus Jaffrey in 1985, where he argued that government could openly support religion. And then you read in the concurring opinion of Lee versus Weissman in 1992, Justice Souter's concurring opinion, where he brought to bear the history I just gave you. What you have is you have incredibly two Supreme Court justices looking at the same history and coming to totally opposite conclusions. But because the Supreme Court at any given moment in time is a final determining factor in what the Constitution means in the United States, if we lose church-state separation in the next 5 years, it could take maybe 100 years to get it back. Because when President Clinton appointed Justice Ginsburg in 1993, a lot of us said, perfect appointment if she were 20 years younger. She was 63 at the time. When President Bush Sr. put Clarence Thomas on the court, he was 41. Chief Justice John Roberts is 55, and Alito is 56. If Roberts and Alito remain on the United States Supreme Court as long as Justice Stevens already has, they each have more than 30 more years to go. And so Justice Scalia is 72, and if he remains on no longer than Justice Stevens' current age, then he has 16 more years to go. So by replacing Justice Stevens with a young religious right-wing sympathizer, they own the court for the next few decades. Now, I know it's troubling to people when they see that the interpretation of the very foundation of personal liberties hinges on any shifting majority of 5 justices on the Supreme Court, but that's the reality. But it does mean this, and for us, since 1947, it has meant that even overwhelming majorities of Americans that wanted religion-favoring laws have failed to achieve it. In 1962, when the United States Supreme Court ruled organized prayer unconstitutional in public schools, 85% of the American people disagreed with their ruling, but there was nothing they could do about it. In 1989, when the Supreme Court correctly ruled that burning one's own individual replica of the American flag is protected free speech, 95% of the American people opposed it and almost amended the United States Constitution to ban flag desecration, but have failed. So even though the highest percentages of the American people opposed secular and free expression rulings by the United States Supreme Court since 1947, even overpowering majorities could not change the import of the decision. But the same would be true. But the problem is that since most Americans favor government sponsorship of religion, the new Supreme Court would be with the majority. But look how powerful the Supreme Court system is. For over 60 years, perhaps the most religious society in the Western world, by overwhelming majorities, have been unable to affect the onward march of secularization of government, at least up until now, when they might regain their majority. And that's how the system works.
Thanks very much. That was good. Thank you.
Well, my question ties in perfectly with where you just left off. So for 60 years, the Supreme Court's been mostly secular, or has been voted, the vote secular. Although it seems as though in the long run, if the majority of people do, the majority of American people are in favor of religious no separation or limited separation, whatever it is, if they're basically religious and opposing secularization, well, it's just a matter of time until eventually you get them electing president who in turn replaces enough justices to sway the decision.
Excellent point. It is maybe a matter of time, but for instance, right now, if a church-state separationist wins the presidency and replaces Justice Stevens, then we have a solid 5-vote majority. Now, in order for the religious right to gain the 5th vote, there would have to be a religious right-wing president who could then replace Justice Ginsburg, who's in poor health, and then maybe retake that majority. However, if a president who favors church-state separation replaces both Justice Stevens and Justice Ginsburg, there is no net gain, but then we have a lock on the 5-vote majority on into the future. And then if no religious right-wing president is able to ultimately replace any of ours, but some of our presidents in the future will eventually replace any of the 4, then we can hold on indefinitely. However, if in this election a religious right-wing sympathizer gains the White House and replaces Stevens and then O'Connor, then the majority against church-state separation at the end of that president's term would be a 6-3 majority against us. So you're right. The people can ultimately impose their view if they can elect enough presidents to remake the Supreme Court. In 61 years, the religious majority in the United States has failed to do so. But this could be their year. That's why I am so frightened and active this year. I have never looked over my shoulder at the religious right gaining speed on me as I have in this year of 2008. So it remains to be seen. But your question is an excellent one. And that is, over decades, can majorities of people who dispute long-standing constitutional provisions, can they ultimately get enough successive presidents to remake the court in their image? And the answer is we have to wait and see.
It's kind of intimidating to come up the microphone after hearing such weighty discussion, so perhaps I'll dial down the weightiness by asking a more microcosmic question. I teach up the road at the University of Toronto, and at least once an academic year, usually more frequently, we get an encyclical from the administration about how as teachers we're expected to respect people's religious blah blah blahs. And that takes the form of us being expected not to schedule exams on religious holidays of high significance for some high number of students, blah blah blah. But what the point I'm trying to make is, on campus we're under pressure to, if you like, desecularize. It's as if the freedom from religion doesn't include freedom of religion. Freedom of religion doesn't include freedom from religion. So if you were a person who was existing on a campus and perhaps saw microcosms of, and I do mean micro because it's much less weighty than the sort of things you were discussing, I'm sure. But what would you say? What would you say as somebody who's very experienced in addressing these issues and in being able to sway people's opinions?
Well,
what do you think is the most effective tactic we can use to fight against the creep of multicultural tolerance?
This is weighty because the University of Toronto is a government institution.
Yeah, it's a public institution.
Because it's a government-run institution, it is weighty. Here, non-believers have to have the courage to take on the multicultural, politically correct left the same as the religious right.
So how should we do that?
The way
That's my
you do
question.
that,
I don't know how to do it.
the way
I'd
you
love
do
to.
that is you form ad hoc alliances with even the religions that you otherwise disagree with to make sure that no one religion gets special consideration.
Smart.
Now, here's a problem. The European Union is considering adopting a blasphemy law which would essentially make it a criminal offense to insult Islam. The left-wing multiculturalists are the apologists for allowing this to happen. The message of the secular humanist to the radical left is that free expression and the right to say things other people find offensive cannot be curtailed just because the motive of censorship comes from the left as opposed to the right. So what has to happen is there has to be universal free speech, and as someone who loves this country and admires Canada, I have to say that there's nothing more important that you can do in order to have free and unbridled public debate, but to restore Canada to its freewheeling intellectual environment by repealing the hate speech law, which is a chill on free expression and was motivated not by the right, but by left-wing political correctness. Because unless free speech is universal, unless we have the liberty to say things that other people find abhorrent, we cannot have an open dialogue. If you don't know whether or not your comments about a religious belief system will land you under prosecution, you will self-censor, and there will be a chill on the full and complete examination of religious doctrine. Religious claims should not have any greater special exemption from ridicule, criticism, and doubt than any other belief system.
Hear, hear.
So that is what's involved.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful.
Yes, hello. I may be feeding your paranoia, but I've heard of some Southern Baptists, which I understand are very powerful in your country,
Oh, yes.
who have kind of infiltrated some of the secular organizations. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I
yourself?
haven't heard of them infiltrating the secular organizations. I have heard of them infiltrating the Bush administration in all sorts of ways, where numerous legal positions have gone to graduates of Pat Robertson's law school. And so I haven't heard of them pervading our secular organizations. So far, we have not discovered Southern Baptist spies anywhere within the Center for Inquiry. I mean, we of course, you know, when people join with us, we don't hire investigators to monitor them, and we haven't yet discovered any of our new employees going back to their dwellings at night and grabbing a Bible saying, "Praise the Lord, I fooled him again." So that I really don't know about.
I understand it was called dirty tricks, okay? This is what they refer to it as themselves.
Well, I have
Haven't
seen
seen
no
it.
evidence. I've seen no evidence of it,
I
and
think we should
and-
look.
Well, you see, I don't want to divert our attention from this election cycle and from where the religious right is obvious, unless there's reason to. So